a good friend of ours, no less. After about a year of having no author events because of this terrible plague throughout our land. And we're hoping to have it in the rearview mirror very soon so that we can all have a normal life again and that we can start to have our again at Benchmark Books. But it's exciting to be here with you, even though it's remotely, but we'll take it any way we can get it in the situation that we're in today. We are going to be having a special presentation by Richard E. Turley tonight, and I will introduce him in a moment. But I just want to say that Benchmark Books is open for business. Our regular hours 10 to 6, Monday through Friday, and you're welcome to come. We do require a mask. I was hoping to say we require a $250 minimum purchase, but I can't say that. So anyway, we'd love to have you come to the store or call us, come to our website, benchmarkbooks.com. We have probably more books than we've ever had, and I'm not exaggerating. And we'd love to have you see what we have and participate in that age-old profession of book selling and book buying. I'd like to acknowledge the help and the participation of Boyd Tuttle, who's making this broadcast available tonight. We're grateful for him providing the technology to make this possible on Zoom. Boyd is also the printer of a book that I'm going to show you in a minute by Richard Turley, one that perhaps some of you are familiar with, but there's a new edition available now. So we'd like to acknowledge and thank Boyd for helping make this possible. Ordinarily, I would be telling bad jokes and taking way too much time. I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm going to give you a brief introduction of our speaker and author, and then I'm going to turn the time over to Richard Turley, who will take about an hour to talk about his two most recent books, if you want to look at them that way. But clear back in 1986, Richard Turley was brought into the employment of the LDS Church in the historical department. Elder Dallin H. Oaks mentored him and has been a friend and brought him in to the fold, so to speak, and in turn of Elder Oaks and President Oaks, I guess I should say now. And he has had a number of positions within the church, including being managing director of church history, family history, and church communications departments. One time there was the entity known as Public Affairs, and Rick was the director, or is that right? Managing director, sorry, of that. He is the author of more than 20 books. He said he's going to get a list together, so even he knows exactly how many books there are. But Rick is a very prolific author, a fine historian, who has made quite a name for himself, and his reputation speaks for itself. I want to just point out, I'm sure a lot of you remember Massacre at Mountain Meadows that Rick authored with Glenn Leonard and the late Ron Walker. This is the volume 1 of what will be a dual set of books on Mountain Meadows. Rick and Barbara Brown, his co-author, are working on a volume 2 right now that I don't know that we have any kind of date to mention yet, but they're still working on that. And we look forward to volume 2, which will start after the massacre and go into that period, important period that occurred after the massacre. I mentioned that there's a new edition of Victims, the LDS Church and the Mark Hofmann case. Rick has just written an afterword that's included in this new paperback edition, of which he is the publisher. And as I mentioned, Boyd is the printer of this new book. And so there's, I think it's 11 pages of new material that kind of updates. I'll let him talk about that. He's going to spend half of his presentation on that book. And In the Hands of the Lord, the life of Dallin H, which is Rick's newest publication that he's also going to talk to us about tonight. Probably the most important thing I could say about Rick is that he's a patron of Benchmark Books. And he's a good friend of us here and of me personally, for which I'm very grateful. I'm going to turn the time now over to Richard E. Turley.
Thank you, Kurt, for that introduction. As Kurt mentioned, he invited me here this evening to talk about 2 recent books, a reissue of my 1992 book, Victims, the LDS Church and the Mark Hofmann Case. And then the other book is my recently published biography of President Dallin H. Oaks, first counselor in the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. To introduce the new reissue of Victims, I want to give you, as the audience, a 14-question quiz. So here it is. Write down your answers if you can, and if you don't have a pencil handy, at least log the answers in your head. Are you ready for the quiz? Here it is. Number 1, am I watching this broadcast? Yes or no? That one's the easiest question. Number 2, do I have a greater than average interest in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Community of Christ, or any other organizations that trace their origins to Joseph Smith Jr.? And I'm going to call that history, in the remaining questions, church history. Question 3, do I frequent bookstores that feature church history volumes? Number 4, do I subscribe to church history journals? Number 5, even if I don't subscribe to church history journals, would I be tempted to pick up and examine one if I happen to see it in a library or in someone's home or office? Number 6, do I access church history websites or social media feeds? Number 7, do I discuss church history on social media? Number 8, do I talk about church history on telephone calls, in texts, or as part of social media conversations? Number 9, do I like to know the latest about church history, including new discoveries, new books, or new articles, virtual or in hard copy? Number 10, do news stories, television programs, or motion pictures about church history attract my attention? Number 11, have I attended a conference like that of the Mormon History Association that features church history topics? Number 12, have I recently felt eager to jump into in-person or virtual conversations about the Mark Hofmann case? Number 13, have I discussed with anyone for longer than 5 minutes the recent Netflix miniseries in which Kurt and I appeared? Right. Did you note your answers? Now, here is the uncomfortable truth. There is a substantial that you would have fallen for one or more of Mark Hofmann's forgeries. Now let that thought settle in for a second. Now, I said there were 14 questions, and I've only asked 13. Here's the 14th one. Ask yourself truthfully, did I backpedal and want to say no when Turley said I would have fallen for a Hofmann forgery? If the answer is yes, then include yourself, unless You answered no to every other question. And if you are among the few people who did object to a Hofmann forgery before the bombings, ask yourself, did you object to all of them? And I will say at this point, I know of no one who came out and said in a public forum forgeries at that point. Now, the recent Netflix miniseries Murder Among the Mormons has been a global sensation and has revived interest in a topic that I have studied for nearly 3.5 decades. As one who has spent a lot of time studying the case, I have found the most interesting recent reactions to it to be the following. Number one, the rush of people who are not really experts on the Hofmann case, who are holding themselves out as experts or want to opine publicly about it. And two, the tremendous amount of Monday morning quarterbacking that is going on virtually or in person by people who want to believe that Hofmann would never have fooled them. Now, why are these reactions interesting to me? Because they reflect a strong human desire to believe that we are too smart to be deceived, that we are not vulnerable to deception, that we would never fall prey to someone like Hofmann. As human beings, we don't want to believe we are vulnerable to deception, just as we don't want to believe that the nice guy next door could be a serial rapist, or that the kindly clerk at the store could be a closet murderer. But the reality is, the most successful criminals have often been the ones who seem the most normal. And their victims have been those who are very intelligent, but never suspected that the criminal was a criminal. Psychologically, it's uncomfortable to believe we could be someone else's easy victim. But guess what? If we are living our lives normally, we are all vulnerable to deception and even murder. If someone, for whatever reason, rational or irrational, decided he or she wanted to take you out, that person could find a time and a place to successfully target you. And the same is true of forgers. What made Mark Hofmann so successful as a criminal, and this is my main point, was not just his skill as a forger, the skill that some have recently praised with wonderment. That was not enough. He needed another skill that he carefully honed, which was how to select and deceive his victims. Among others, he targeted church history experts and aficionados, just like many of us. He studied their strengths and weaknesses and knew just how to exploit them. He knew how to play on their biases. If you were a believer, he knew how to exploit that bias. If you were not, he knew how to exploit that too. Had Hofmann been more careful with his finances and not resorted to killing, many people would still believe his forgeries to be authentic today. Even after the bombings, many of his most ardent defenders were the kind of people my quiz questions identified. Why did they continue to support him? Because he deceived them so thoroughly. Now, why am I telling you this in a session that features a re-release of my book, Victims? For one simple reason. Human psychology is such that you may not want to believe that Mark Hofmann could have deceived you. Some books on the Hofmann case confirm that bias by starting with the bombings. Why does starting with the bombings make a difference? Because once the authors tell you as a reader that there have been murders, you as a reader are suspicious to an extent you would not have been in real life before the bombings. My book, on the other hand, uses a diachronic approach, one in which you as a reader get information about Hofmann and the documents just as people at the time did in real time. But, you might want to argue, I already know from other sources that he was a murderer, and so why would starting with the bombings make any difference to me? And the answer is because it would color the rest of the narrative, make victims look more naive than they actually were at the time, and therefore lull you as a reader into thinking you are not vulnerable, which actually makes you more vulnerable to future potential deception. If you follow Samuel Taylor Coleridge's concept of suspending your disbelief when you read victims, and try to concentrate on seeing how the forgeries were created and rolled out, how they were examined, how there was skepticism, how people measured that skepticism against the tests that were done at the time, you will come to understand how Mark Hofmann was able to make people victims. And if you really understand this case and understand it well, you're not going to read a book or see a movie and say, no, not me. You know, I can't see that he could fool me. Instead, what you're likely to say is something more akin to, there, but for the grace of God, go I. And just so you know, many historians and history aficionados outside of the comparatively small group of people interested in our church history also have a problem, except that they may not be aware of it. Many who have heard of Hofmann have thought, yeah, I get it. This thing happened among those backwater Mormons. It could never happen here in my city or at my university. Well, let me tell you a story. A few years ago, we here in Utah hosted the national conference of the Association of Documentary Editors. These are the specialists around the country, particularly at fine universities, who spend their lives as experts of well-known national historical figures, editing and publishing their papers. I was asked to give a luncheon address to the group on the Hofmann case, and I began with telling the parts of it related to church history. The luncheon took place in a large ballroom at the Marriott Hotel on State Street in Salt Lake City, and it had a large audience. As I talked about Hofmann and church history, the people in the audience listened respectfully, but perhaps assumed my talk was not all that relevant to them in their projects. Near the end of my talk, I referenced an incident noted on page 348 of my book, which I'm going to read right now. When investigators shook down Hofmann's cell in 1988, they found a sheet of paper on which Hofmann had listed the historical figures whose autographs he had forged. He was apparently trying to remember his work. On one side of the sheet are listed the following figures prominent in Mormon or Utah history. And I then listed all of these figures whose names were on the paper. The audience was listening again with that same respectful nod. And then I said, many of these names appear in the documents described below in my appendix, though considering Hofmann's record of deception, it is difficult to place unwavering trust in this list of forged documents, or for that matter, in many of the other Hofmann admissions cited in the notes that follow. Although I will say in the years that have passed since then, we have been able to find a forgery for nearly every name on his list. So I do think this was likely an honest attempt on his part to try to remember his work for his own purposes. Then I said this to the group at that conference. The other side of the sheet discovered in Hofmann's cell bore the names of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, William H. Bonney, Billy the Kid, Daniel Boone, John Brown, Emily Dickinson, Button Gwinnett, Nathan Hale, John Hancock, Andrew Jackson, Francis Scott Key, Abraham Lincoln, Jack London, Thomas Lynch Jr., John Milton, William C. Quantrill, Paul Revere, Betsy Ross, Chaim Solomon, Miles Standish, Mark Twain, George Washington, and Martha Washington. None of these names appear in the church-owned documents. As I slowly read the names of those well-known historical figures one at a time, I heard moans, groans, sighs, and gasps from the members of our distinguished luncheon audience. After the luncheon, people approached me to say, "We thought this was just your problem in Utah. Now we recognize that it is a problem for all of us." And so it is. It's a problem for you, it's a problem for me, and it's a problem for anyone with an interest in history. Now, ahead of time, Benchmark Books submitted a request for questions from the audience. We only got 6 questions, 3 of them related to victims. So I will read those questions and then answer them. Question number 1. Do you feel Hofmann's grand motive was to destroy the LDS Church? I think, given the totality of the evidence, there were 3 major motivations for Hofmann. One was clearly to defy authority. He did not like authority figures of any kind, and he liked to do what he could to try to show he was smarter than any of those persons. Number 2 motivation on his part was to make money. Document forgery was his way of making a living for 5 years of his life at least. And motive number 3 was to undermine the history of the church. And when I say the church, I mean the history of the Church of Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints, the Community of Christ, any other entity that he could write a document for that might be interested in it. Question number 2, what are your thoughts on who was to receive the 3rd bomb? The answer is, we probably will never know for sure. Brent Ashworth feels it was probably directed to him, and he has a good reason for believing that, based on his normal expectation of meeting with Hofmann on the very day of the week when the bomb went off. There are others who similarly feel that the bomb may have been intended for them, and they can make good cases for that as well. Hofmann claimed in the Board of Pardons hearing that you heard at the end of Murder Among the Mormons that it was a suicide attempt. I don't believe it was a suicide attempt, but I do believe that it was intended to target someone else and that we do not know for sure who that is. Question number 3. In Murder Among the Mormons, you seem to make reference to the fact that the leaders of the LDS Church got led astray was because Mark did not believe, and both of the parties had to have the spirit for the LDS leaders not to be led astray. How does that make any sense when your leaders have said that he never be led astray, as seen in the say in Murder Among the Mormons? And whoever sent this question, I just invite you to go back and listen to what I said. I did not say that they got led astray because both parties didn't have the spirit. That wasn't in my statement at all. So I invite you to go back and listen to the 3rd segment of Murder Among the Mormons again. There was one more question submitted that was about both of the books I'm discussing here this evening, and that question is, I have not yet read Victims or President Oaks's biography, but I am curious about the role that President Oaks played in the Mark Hofmann case. To the media's questions, it seemed like Elder Oaks' expertise with the law would have been beneficial for the church, as he was a newly called apostle. Yes, he did respond to some media questions at a press conference that was held shortly afterwards. If you want to know what his role was in the case, that's a nice segue to my next book, In the Hands of the Lord. I do talk about President Oaks' role in the Mark Hofmann case briefly in the new book, which I'm about to talk about next. That's a good segue into the next book. So to introduce that book, In the Hands of the Lord, The Life of Dallin H. Oaks, I'd like to do some readings from the book. So I'd like to begin with a period in his life in which he was very young. The family had moved to Twin Falls, Idaho, and that's where his first memories are. So I'll pick up with that. My first memories, Dallin recorded, are of Twin Falls, Idaho, where we moved the summer I was 2 and where we lived until I was nearly 8. When Dallin grew old enough, he attended the nearby Washington School. My first grade report card, he summarized, showed satisfactory progress in most areas, special recognition in reading, and negative marks beside avoids unnecessary talking and sings with clear light tones. According to Stella, his mother, Dallin adored his first grade teacher, telling her, "I wish you were smart enough to teach me in second grade too." So this shows you that he got a good early start on his education. But then catastrophe struck the family. His father, who was a medical doctor, contracted a disease, probably from one of his patients, and ultimately died of that disease, which came as a great blow to a young family. So picking up later in the book, page 11, Stella, that's Dallin's mother, now found herself with a choice. She and her children could either live with her aging parents indefinitely, or she could strike. Chose the latter, leaving Dallin and his siblings with her parents in Utah a few months later when she left to seek a master's degree at Columbia University in New York. The death of their father and departure of their mother left the children without both birth parents, but they were not abandoned. Our maternal grandparents, S.A. and Chastity Harris, Dallin remembered, took us to their hearts and were our parents for the 2 turbulent years that followed. These were not easy times for mother or children. For Stella, the loneliness resulting from this abrupt separation from her family so soon after the loss of her husband and the rigors of graduate study strained her beyond the breaking point, Dallin remembered. In the spring of 1941, she suffered a complete nervous breakdown. The affliction required medical supervision away from her family for many months as she fought mightily to regain her mental health. Dallin's loving grandparents did the best they could to care for Dallin and his siblings during this time, but could not fully replace Lloyd and Stella, his parents. The 2 years following my father's death were difficult years for me, Dallin confessed. I too felt the shock of separation, having lost the companionship of both father and mother and the security of home in one wrenching summer. I have but few memories of my 3rd and 4th grade years, and none of them happy. The 2 miles between his grandparents' farm and Payson, where the schools were located, meant he had to ride a bus, which was filled mostly with high school students who hazed and bullied Dallin and other grade schoolers. The high schoolers grabbed the seats on the bus, leaving the younger students to stand. Once the bus reached the high school, Dallin had to walk 1 more mile to the grade school. If I was late getting back to the bus after school, Dallin noted, it was gone and I had to walk the 2 miles home. Like many, Mason felt the impact of World War II. Dallin's 4th grade teacher was a harried older man who held on in those war years to teach 3 rows of 5th and 2 rows of 4th graders. His teaching methods included announcing all the children's arithmetic scores to the class, embarrassing Dallin, who struggled with the subject. In a 20-problem exercise, I usually had 15 or 16 wrong answers, Dallin recalled. I knew I was the dumbest boy in the room. I remember one occasion when some classmates threw rocks or snowballs at me and called me stupid. Reading became his escape and a way to learn without the strictures of the classroom. My pleasantest memory in this period was reading, he wrote. From the tiny Payson library, I obtained and read several books each week, becoming a rapid and prodigious reader who knew how to use a library. Those skills would serve him throughout his life. In August 1942, mother being much improved, our little family was ready to function unassisted, Dallin wrote, and we moved to Vernal, Utah, where mother obtained a teaching position at the high school. There I was blessed with a stable home and family environment with the guidance of my marvelous mother. I was also blessed with a great 5th grade teacher, Miss Pearl Schaefer, who was mature and loving. Through a wise combination of confidence and challenge, she put me back on the path of learning and gave me many happy moments. Now I'm going to skip ahead to a period when he made another move, this one from Vernal to Provo. To introduce this, I'm going to say that in Vernal, he flourished. He had a mother at home to guide him. He did relatively well in school, and he became extremely interested in radio, which was sort of the cutting edge technology of his day. He began to study radio. He received the coveted first-class radio telephone operator's license as a teenager. And he bought a book, Elements of Radio, which he checked out, which he acquired, and then he checked out a lot of other books from the Vernal Public Library about radio. I also began to buy radio parts to assemble in my basement workshop, he said. First a crystal set, and then more complicated apparatus from Army communications gear, then cheap and abundant on the surplus market. During the winter of 1948, he recounted, I traveled to Salt Lake City for the 4-part FCC examination. I passed 3 parts, which qualified me for the 2nd-class license. About 3 months later, I rode to Denver, Colorado on the bus, accompanied by a friend. There he passed the 4th part of the exam, qualifying him for the 1st-class license. My license was dated May 21st, 1948, 3 months before my 16th birthday, he wrote. I was probably one of the youngest license holders in the nation. Employment quickly followed his certification. Within weeks, he related, I had a job at Vernal's newly established 250-watt radio station, KJAM, 1340 on the dial, whose small studios were in the basement of the Vernal Hotel. Although my voice was squeaky, I was promised an opportunity to announce as I gained experience. My joy knew no bounds. And then something happened to rock his 1948 universe. By early July, Dallin's mother, Stella, had completed her education enough to qualify for an administrative position in the Provo, Utah school system. Financially, it was a decided step upward, but it didn't come without cost. It would disrupt her children's increasingly stable lives. With heavy heart, Dallin wrote, she tested her children's reaction to the move. About to enter my junior year in high school and just starting a coveted job in a radio station, I had the most to lose by the move, he remembered. He wasn't sure he could compete in school, radio, or athletics in the new, larger town, but he saw the move was inevitable. Rather than pout in self-pity at their new destination, Dallin did what life had taught him to do when facing challenges. He went to work. He rode ahead of his family to Provo with the moving truck, and after helping unload it, he went searching for employment at a nearby radio station. When Mother, Merrill, and Evelyn, his siblings, arrived by car a day later, he wrote, I had a job at KCSU and was optimistic about my future in this new home. And so I tell you this to let you know that as a youth, he encountered a lot of difficulties, but in the process of learning to overcome those difficulties, he developed an incredible work ethic, probably the most incredible work ethic I've seen in any human being. He is a remarkable worker even today in the later years of his life. Now I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to help you understand how he chose the law as a career. He had joined the ROTC and liked the idea of being in the military because his father had been in a military unit, and this was essentially the same unit that he was joining. But he said, I began college with the weak assumption that I would study medicine like my father, he wrote, but it was soon apparent that this was not for me. The experience of cutting up a frog and dissecting the eye of a beef in an introductory zoology class persuaded me that I had no interest in medicine. In fact, I was not strongly drawn to any field. Part of the problem was that he was being pulled in several directions at once. I was seriously distracted by my vulnerability to immediate mobilization in these beginning months of the Korean War, he reflected, and fully occupied with about 30 hours per week at the radio station. His radio career had blossomed, and he was now chief engineer and senior announcer, roles that allowed him to choose his work hours and made it possible to schedule his day around college classes. He also enjoyed the increased income, which permitted him to retire his motorbike and buy a 1938 Chevrolet Coupe. After deciding he disliked medicine as a career, he thought briefly about other technical fields. But the sciences required expertise in mathematics, an area in which he struggled. He took algebra fall semester as a freshman at BYU and got a C+ grade. He then took trigonometry during winter semester and managed just a C-. After that, he dropped the solid geometry course he planned to take during spring term. I was obviously weak in math, he quipped, but I knew a trend when I saw one. Despite working as a radio engineer, he felt that the math debacle, as he called it, ruled out radio engineering or other sciences as career choices, yet he had begun to rule them out anyway. I thought the sciences were too much in the back room, he decided, and I wanted to work with people. So that, along with a suggestion from a relative and a meeting with Ernest Wilkinson, pointed him in the direction of the law. Ultimately, he obtained a scholarship to the University of Chicago Law School. In the early days of his life in Chicago with his wife and children, his wife June and their children, they lived in a home that they were able to reserve before they got there. It was an army barracks. So I'm going to pick up from that point. Dallin and June's humble apartment was in a converted army barracks where an oil-fired space heater provided warmth for the family during the frigid Chicago winters. They filled the heater's tank by hand from oil drums on the street outside. And I've got a picture in the book of the barracks, and just out on the porch, there are these barrels of heating oil. When our two daughters were ages 2 and 3, Dallin recounted, the older one dipped her little cup down into the oil tank on the back of the heater, took a large drink of the clear fuel oil, and then shared it generously with her younger sister. Bad results followed, and June had to rush them to the hospital to have their stomachs pumped. Several weeks later, the little girls climbed up into our medicine cabinet and seized a bottle of candy-flavored cough syrup that included some sedative drug. Cooperatively alternating their draws at the bottle, the two finished its contents with predictable results. June grabbed one child under each arm and rushed for the hospital again. After the second incident, Dallin and June received a visit from a Chicago public health nurse inquiring into their fitness to care for children. As extraordinarily conscientious parents, they were mortified. In the meantime, however, Dallin wrote, one of my playful law school classmates was heard to tell a group that Dallin and June Oakes wouldn't drink anything, but their daughters would drink everything. He graduated from law school, became a clerk in the United States Supreme Court, and then ultimately went into private practice in Chicago with the largest law firm in Chicago at the time. He was liked by the administrators of the law firm, the senior partners, and they put him on a track to become one of the top lawyers in the firm. That required him to work enormously long hours. He worked late into the night, many nights, and throughout many weekends and on holidays. Then I'm going to pick up again at page 77 of the book. In early 1961, this is a turning point in his life, Dallin was invited to lunch by a man he admired greatly, Chicago State President John K. Edmonds, himself a practicing lawyer. Over lunch, President Edmonds called Dallin to serve a stake mission and to be a counselor in the stake mission presidency. June had earlier had a premonition about that, which meant he shouldn't have been surprised, but he was. I told him, Dallin wrote, that I couldn't have been any more surprised if he had asked me to be the staff physician in a hospital. I told him I'd never turned down a church job and that I wasn't going to start now, but did he know that he was calling a man to a position of leadership and missionary work who had never been on a mission? He hadn't served a mission as a young man because of the Korean War. Yes, President Edmonds answered. Both he and the stake mission president were aware of that, and both felt confident he was the person for the job. In extending the call, Dallin wrote, President Edmonds told him the calling would require 40 hours of proselyting per month, plus gospel study and other time, equivalent to at least 3 to 4 evenings every week. Since Dallin's heavy load at the firm already kept him at work 3 or 4 evenings a week, the calling required a great exercise of faith. I couldn't see how I could accept this calling and still keep up with my law practice, Dallin agonized. Yet I could not say no to a calling that I knew to be from the Lord, especially when that calling came through a servant of the Lord who had wielded such a powerful influence in teaching me righteous principles. Gathering all my faith, I accepted the call. That evening, he went on his first missionary visit with the stake mission president, who was then his missionary companion. Thereafter, for 2 years, Dallin labored an average of 30 hours a month doing missionary work and spent additional time fulfilling his duties in the mission presidency. June supported me completely, he wrote. The full-time mission experience I had missed was at least partly recompensed in this choice experience. Dallin and his companions baptized some 10 people from 5 different families. We attracted some, he summarized, but mostly met contacts we had generated through friendship or on referral from church members. And I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here to show how this changed his life. His sister went on missionary about that time. He wrote her a letter that was very enthusiastic about missionary work. And then the book picks up there. Dallin took this advice himself. He worked hard and humbly, refusing to be discouraged. His stake mission brought with it a wealth of gospel knowledge as he studied the scriptures and learned from the stake mission president, a man of faith. But perhaps the greatest learning came from Dallin's own exercise of faith. Logically speaking, it did not seem possible for him to fulfill his church calling and perform well at the law firm. But he came to recognize the unusual, even miraculous blessings that come to those who serve the Lord. After just 2 weeks of missionary service, he testified to his mother in a letter, I am deriving great happiness from this work, and I know the Lord is blessing me to accomplish my legal work with greater efficiency so that I can give my full devotion to his service. By the end of March, he reported to loved ones, my missionary work continues at a fearful pace. My whole day is upside down already, and my primary devotion is to my missionary work, with law being secondary, yet I am getting my work done. Though I was devoting less time to law firm work, Dallin later reflected, my advancement in the firm and my success in my work seemed to accelerate rather than decline. On several occasions, I received late afternoon assignments for night work when I had an evening missionary appointment. After fervent prayer, I went to the firm library and was prompted in where to look to complete my research assignment and with words to write the memo in record time. In 2 years, I did not have to break one missionary appointment. Once he thought he would have to skip a missionary appointment when he was assigned to meet with a legal client the same evening, but then the missionary contact phoned to postpone the meeting because of his own conflict. Feeling the Lord magnify me professionally as I sought to serve him, Dallin concluded, solidified my commitment to serve the Lord first, knowing that I could do more professionally in part of my time with his help than in all of my time without it. And I will say this, at a time when he was succeeding admirably at the law firm and was on a track to make a considerable amount of money as one of the senior lawyers in the firm, his experience as a missionary, combined with his realization that he was helping large corporations and not individuals, bothered him. He wanted to help the downtrodden, and he did a number of things which you can read in the book to help people who were underrepresented. So the combination of his missionary work, his desire to help the underrepresented and so forth, eventually led him to leave the law firm and become a professor at the University of Chicago, which eventually set him on a track to where he is today. And now I'm going to answer the 2 questions that were submitted about his book. Question number 1, having written an entire book about one of the Lord's anointed, in what ways did God prepare Dallin H. Oakes to fill the position he now holds as a member of the First Presidency? And I will simply say that if you read through the first portion of the book, which talks about the period before he became a general authority, you'll see how the decisions he made along the way put him on the track to being where he eventually ended up. He made decisions, choices that at the time may have seemed large or small, but decisions that ultimately led him to be prepared for when the call came from President Gordon B. Hinckley to become an apostle. Question number 2, we can learn different lessons from each apostle. What is an overarching message or lesson that members of the church can learn from the life of Dallin H. Oaks? I think there are a number of lessons that can be learned. One is his incredible work ethic. He has given talks in which he has said that it's very difficult to plan your life. So what you can do is you can take advantage of the opportunities that are available to you and work extremely hard to develop yourself from those activities, and then wait to see which direction your opportunities will take you. I've often thought, I didn't put this in the book, but I've often thought to myself that when Dallin Oaks was a freshman at BYU, if he'd gone in to talk to a counselor about what he wanted his future to be and had laid out the life that eventually became his, if he had said to the counselor, I think I want to graduate from this school and go to one of the top law schools in the country. And then I think I want to become a U.S. Supreme Court clerk. And then I think after that, I want to become a lawyer with one of the top firms in Chicago. And then I think I want to teach at one of the top law schools in the country. At one point, becoming an administrator of the law school. Then after that, I think I want to become the executive director of the institution. And then after 9 years of doing that, I think I'll, sort of go off, and I think I'll become a Utah Supreme Court clerk. And then I think at the end of all that, I'd like to be an apostle. If he had said that as an entering freshman, what would the guidance counselor have told him? Probably, look, psychiatric counseling is down the hallway. I encourage you to go have a conversation with one of our people there. That was simply not something he could script. And so he led his life by working hard, preparing well, and then just following the opportunities that presented themselves along the way. And I've heard him give talks in which he's encouraged other people to do the same thing. So I think that's one thing we can learn, is that life doesn't always go the way we want it, but we can prepare ourselves for whatever comes and then take advantage of those experiences. We've got 13 minutes left, and I noticed that the chat room has 27 comments. Let's see if any of those are questions. I'm going to pop it up and move things like reading the book. I didn't feel so bad about my workload. Yeah, I had people who've read the book and said the book made me tired just listening to all the things that he did and had to do in his various responsibilities. How much influence, the next question, how much influence did President Oaks have in the book? Interviews and diaries. The answer is, this is an official biography, so it's one I did with his intense cooperation. I did have access to his diaries, which I consider to be among the top diaries ever written by a Latter-day Saint church leader. And he was freely available for interviews when I wanted them or to answer questions. We also maintained a very vigorous conversation back and forth. There are a lot of memos that passed between us with information that'll someday, I think, be in my papers. Next one. Good question, as his name is on the copyright along with Rick Turley. Exactly. So we're both on the copyright page. How did he meet Kristen? That's a story I tell in the book. Kristen is his second wife. His first wife died of cancer. Sometime after his first wife died, he made a determination that it was time to get married again. And so he made a determination to call some people he deeply trusted about whether or not they knew people who could be potential marriage candidates for him. One of the persons he called was then Elder M. Russell Ballard. Elder M. Russell Ballard had just been visited by a woman named Kristen McMain, who was in her 50s. She had had a great job traveling around as promoting books for kindergarten through 12th grade age school children. And she had asked her bishop for a blessing, and the bishop had given her a blessing, which she'd said essentially, if you continue on the path you're on, you'll have a good life, but you'll miss, many of the blessings that you're expecting. And she took that blessing to heart and decided, well, then I'm not going to continue on this path. I'm going to quit my job. She had a couple of aunts that thought she was maybe a little unwise in deciding to leave steady employment as a single woman. And so they contacted a relative, Elder M. Russell Ballard, and asked him if he couldn't maybe direct her towards publishing opportunities in the Utah area, which is where she wanted to live. That meeting that he had with her came just before Elder Oaks called to ask if Elder Ballard knew any marriage prospects. And so he lined them up essentially. Later on at their marriage, they gave him those gold-covered chocolate coins as a finder's fee for helping to put them together. How close was he to getting the U.S. Supreme Court? His name frequently appeared on lists of people and was published in magazines and newspapers as on lists of people who were potential candidates for the court. At one time, he was offered the opportunity to be on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. He declined the opportunity and instead let it go to one of his friends who called him about it and said, look, if you want this job, I will let it go to you. But if you don't want it, I'd appreciate getting it and having support from some of your people. And then Justice Oaks of the Utah Supreme Court said, I don't want it right now. It just doesn't feel right to me. He always went on the basis of how he felt he was being guided spiritually. Says it doesn't feel right to me, but you go ahead and take it and I'll do what I can to support you. The person who took that job was Antonin Scalia, who then became a U.S. Supreme Court justice. So you could argue that had Dallin Oaks taken that responsibility, he may well have ended up on the court. That's entirely impossible to know for certain, but there's a significant possibility there. Does the book address the hinge point event when he made a decision not to engage a young man who was attempting to rob him in Chicago? Yes, it does tell that story, not in as much detail as it's told elsewhere because there wasn't room. But for those of you who haven't heard the story, he and his wife, June, were taking a woman home from a church activity in South Chicago. And then Professor Oaks walked her to her door and came back to his car where June was with the doors locked. And a young man with a gun approached him and basically tried to rob him. And it was not a large young man. President Oaks, relatively large. And so at one point he thought, at just the right moment, I can basically push this gun away and take the guy down. And he had a strong impression, no, don't do that. Because if you do, the gun's likely to go off, he's going to be killed and you'll have to wrestle with that the rest of your life. And so he resisted that sort of natural human impression to want to fight back. And he simply just talked to the young man, lectured him a bit, put his hand on his shoulder, told him what he was doing was not right. The man said, look, I want your money. He took out his wallet, showed him he didn't have anything really, didn't have much. He wanted to be led into the car with June, and President Oaks, then Professor Oaks said, no, I'm not going to let you do that. And eventually a bus came by. The young man pulled the gun to where it couldn't be seen, but where Dallin was still in danger. And then when the bus left, he threatened him again. And eventually he ran off. But yeah, that was one of a number of incidents he's had in his life that are a little bit hair-raising. Has there been a younger apostle called to the quorum since Elder Oaks? He was 45, if I recall. Let's see, how old would he have been? He was born in 1932. He was called in 1984. So, yeah, he was 51 when he was called. And Elder Packer was 45. Tyler Smith writes to everyone. This is from, this question is, I heard the story that Boyd K. Packer asked him to take the role of Bruce R. McConkie as one who clarifies doctrine. Is it common for the 12 to identify with particular roles throughout their service, or does that feel unique? Okay, I'm going to give you my observations as one who was very close to the senior leaders of the church for more than 3 decades. My observation is that there are certain roles that are necessary in order to administer the church well. There need to be some people who are constantly looking after the financial affairs of the church to make sure that everything is squeaky clean and running well. And there seem to be certain apostles who are well suited by background to become the sort of financial overseers of what goes on. There are others who seem to be naturally inclined towards doctrinal exposition. And certainly Bruce R. McConkie felt he was in that kind of role. And that seemed to be a natural role, particularly because Elder McConkie died shortly after Elder Oaks became an apostle. That was a role into which Elder Oaks towards which he naturally inclined. And Elder Packer did say that he felt that there was a need for doctrinal experts among the younger members of the 12 at that time. One person asked, if I recall, Brother Oaks counseled Mark Hofmann to turn himself in. Yeah, Elder Oaks met Mark Hofmann only once for a very short period of time. He visited him after the bombings. He said, you know, I may be questioned by investigators. And Elder Oaks, who had very little to do with any of the prior negotiations, he said, well, so what? You know? And he said, well, what am I supposed to tell him? And he said, well, tell him the truth. What do you think you should say? Of course, tell him the truth if they ask. It's a very short meeting. I don't think it was very satisfactory to Mark Hofmann. And when he walked away, Elder Oaks thought, this guy's really strange. That was sort of the reaction. Okay, I think we're just about there. Kurt, do you want to say anything in conclusion?
Well, that was wonderful, especially for our first and perhaps not last remote author event. And now we've shown we can do it. And my thanks to Rick for making his time available and sharing this much, 2 books. We don't usually get to hear about 2 books in one night. So I'm very grateful to Rick for being with us tonight. I think that the viewership was somehow limited. I don't know whether it was accidentally or not, or if the capacity just wasn't there, but I feel bad if anyone has missed this. But I wanted to say, because I don't think I did earlier, that this will be available on our website at benchmarkbooks.com. I think you'll be able to look it up on YouTube as well. I want to remind you that the books that Rick has talked about tonight, as well as the other books that he's written, and literally thousands of other titles, please give us a call or come in. We really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you for joining us, and good night.